The gavel came down 3 times that September morning, and with it, 8 lives changed forever. Standing on those weathered courthouse steps in Millfield County, I thought I was just making a business decision. Another property acquisition, another investment in my growing empire of cattle ranches and farmland. But when I saw those faces, 6 children ranging from barely walking to nearly grown, their parents holding them close like they were preparing to say goodbye, I realized this wasn't about land or money or expanding my holdings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was about something I'd never understood before, what it means to lose everything and what it costs to save it. By the time the sun set that day, the entire territory would be talking about what happened on those courthouse steps. Some called it charity, others called it madness, but none of them knew the real reason behind my decision or how it would uncover secrets that had been buried in Millfield County for over 2 decades. The morning started like any other in my routine. Dawn broke over the Broken Arrow Ranch at exactly 5:47 a.m., painting the endless Montana sky in shades of amber and rose. I'd been awake for an hour already, reviewing the day's schedule over black coffee and yesterday's livestock reports. My foreman, Jake Morrison, would be checking the north pastures where we'd moved the yearlings last week. The veterinarian was due at 9 to examine the pregnant mares. And at 11 sharp, I had an appointment at the Millfield County Courthouse to finalize the purchase of the Henderson property, 300 acres of prime grazing land that bordered my existing holdings. The Henderson place had been in foreclosure for 8 months. Bank notices, unpaid taxes, the usual story of a small family farm that couldn't compete with the larger operations. I'd made my offer through my attorney, Maxwell Sterling, 6 weeks prior. It was a fair price, maybe even generous, considering the property's condition. But business was business. The land would round out my southeastern boundary perfectly, and the existing barn structures could be renovated to house additional equipment. I finished my coffee, pulled on my best jacket, the charcoal grey one my housekeeper insisted I wear to important meetings, and drove the 23 miles to Millfield in my pickup truck. The courthouse sat in the center of town, a red brick building from the 1890s with tall windows and a clock tower that had been keeping accurate time for over a century. Foreclosure auctions always drew a crowd. Investors, bargain hunters, neighbors, hoping to witness either salvation or downfall. But as I climbed those courthouse steps, something felt different about this particular morning. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everyone gathered there. Small groups of people stood clustered together, speaking in low voices, glancing frequently toward the building's main entrance. I recognized most of the faces. Millfield County wasn't large enough for true anonymity, but their expressions were unfamiliar. Instead of the usual anticipation or curiosity that accompanied these events, I saw something that looked disturbingly like grief. Maxwell was waiting for me near the main doors, his briefcase in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. He'd been my attorney for 12 years, handling everything from property acquisitions to contract negotiations, and I'd never seen him look so uncomfortable. His usually immaculate appearance seemed somehow disheveled, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. Perhaps it was the way he kept adjusting his tie, or how his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine when he approached. "Good morning, Thomas," he said, extending his hand for our customary handshake. "Everything's in order for the Henderson acquisition. The paperwork is straightforward, no complications expected." But his voice carried an odd note, something between reluctance and warning that I couldn't interpret. Before I could ask what was troubling him, the courthouse doors opened and a small procession emerged. At first I thought it might be the conclusion of an earlier hearing, perhaps a routine civil matter or minor criminal case. Then I saw them clearly, and my understanding of the morning's events shifted entirely. A man and woman, both appearing to be in their early 40s, walked slowly down the steps. The man wore a suit that had seen better years, clean but showing signs of careful maintenance and repeated mending. His wife, for the way they moved together, suggested a long marriage, dressed in what was clearly her finest outfit, a navy dress with small pearl buttons and shoes that had been polished to disguise their age. Between them and following, behind, came 6 children, arranged by height like a living staircase. The oldest appeared to be a girl of perhaps 15 or 16, with her mother's dark hair braided carefully down her back. She carried a toddler who couldn't have been more than 2 years old, his small arms wrapped trustingly around her neck. Behind them came twin boys who looked to be around 10, their faces solemn in a way that children's faces should never be. A girl of perhaps 7 or 8 held the hand of another boy, maybe 12, and all of them moved with the careful precision of children who had been instructed to behave perfectly during an important and serious event. They reached the bottom of the courthouse steps and arranged themselves in a small group, the parents standing protectively in front while the children gathered close behind. The woman, their mother, held a small suitcase, the kind that might contain important documents or treasured photographs. The man's hands were empty, except for a folded piece of paper that he gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I realized with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that these were the Hendersons. This was the family whose farm I was about to purchase, whose home I was essentially taking away through the cold mechanics of legal and financial processes. Somehow, in all the months of negotiations and paperwork and planning, they had remained abstract to me, names on documents, signatures on contracts, obstacles to be navigated rather than human beings whose lives were being fundamentally disrupted. The auctioneer, a thin man named Wallace Griffith, who'd been conducting these proceedings for the county for over a decade, emerged from the courthouse carrying his wooden podium and a thick folder of legal documents. He positioned himself on the steps, approximately halfway between the building's entrance and where the Henderson family stood waiting. His voice, when he began to speak, carried easily across the gathered crowd despite the early morning wind. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the court-ordered sale of properties in Millfield County to satisfy outstanding debts and tax obligations. First item for consideration is the Henderson family property, consisting of 312 acres of mixed farmland and grazing pasture, together with all buildings, improvements and fixtures thereon. The legal language felt harsh and impersonal in contrast to the very human drama unfolding before us. Wallace continued reading from his documents, describing property boundaries and tax assessments and lien holders, but my attention had shifted entirely to the family standing at the bottom of the steps. The oldest girl had adjusted her grip on the toddler and was whispering something to him, perhaps trying to keep him calm and quiet during the proceedings. The mother had placed her free hand on the shoulder of the 7-year-old, a gesture so protective and tender that it made something tight form in my chest. Current outstanding debt totals $47,832, including accrued interest and legal fees, Wallace announced. Bidding will commence at $48,000 to cover all obligations. Do I hear 48,000? The silence that followed was deafening. I glanced around at the assembled crowd, recognizing several local businessmen and property investors who typically participated in these auctions. But no one raised a hand or called out a bid. The amount wasn't unreasonable for the acreage involved, particularly given the property's location and potential. Under normal circumstances, there should have been immediate interest, possibly even competitive bidding. $48,000, Wallace repeated, his voice slightly louder. Do I hear 48,000 to open the bidding? More silence. The Henderson family remained motionless, but I could see the tension in their postures, the way the parents seemed to be holding their breath. The oldest girl had begun swaying slightly, a gentle rocking motion to keep the toddler content. But her eyes were fixed on the auctioneer with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what was happening here. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. Pinned to the man's jacket was a small ribbon, the kind typically worn to honor military service. But this wasn't just any ribbon. It was the distinctive purple and gold of the Combat Action Ribbon, accompanied by what appeared to be campaign medals from overseas deployments. This wasn't simply a family losing their farm to economic hardship. This was a veteran, someone who had served his country, watching his life's work disappear because of circumstances I didn't yet understand. 45,000, Wallace called, lowering his opening bid. Surely someone will bid 45,000 for this prime agricultural property. The continued silence was becoming uncomfortable. I could see people in the crowd shifting their weight, looking at their shoes, anywhere but at the family, standing so quietly at the bottom of the steps. There was something happening here that I didn't understand, some undercurrent of local knowledge or community dynamics that was keeping potential bidders away. Maxwell leaned closer to me and spoke in a low voice. "Thomas, there's something you should know about this situation. The Henderson family, they're not just losing their farm. The foreclosure includes a provision that essentially makes them responsible for their own relocation costs. If no one bids high enough to cover the full debt, they'll still owe the difference. Plus, they'll have nowhere to live." The implications hit me immediately. This wasn't just a property transfer. It was a complete destruction of this family's life. They would lose their home, their livelihood, and still be left with debt they couldn't possibly repay. The children would be displaced, possibly separated if the parents couldn't find adequate housing for such a large family. The oldest girl would likely have to quit school to help support the family. The younger ones might end up in foster care if their parents couldn't provide stable housing. 40,000. Wallace tried again, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. "The court requires this property to be sold today. Do I hear $40,000? I found myself studying the family more closely. The father held himself with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to military discipline, but there was something in his bearing that suggested injury or chronic pain. The mother's careful attention to each child, the way she seemed to be silently counting and recounting to ensure they were all present and safe, spoke of someone accustomed to managing crisis and uncertainty. These weren't people who had been irresponsible or careless with their obligations. Something had gone wrong. Illness, injury, market collapse, or simple bad luck, and they were paying a price that seemed entirely disproportionate to whatever mistakes they might have made. The toddler in the oldest girl's arms had begun to fuss slightly, making small sounds of discomfort or confusion. She adjusted her hold on him and began humming softly, a lullaby that carried just far enough for me to recognize the melody. It was an old song, something my own mother had sung to me decades earlier, and hearing it in this context, a teenage girl trying to comfort her baby brother while watching her family's life dissolve around them, created an emotional response I wasn't prepared for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 35,000, Wallace announced, his voice now clearly frustrated. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exceptional agricultural property at a price that represents tremendous value. Surely someone recognizes this opportunity. But still, no one moved. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind through the courthouse elms and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. I began to understand that this wasn't about economics or property values. The local community knew something about this family's situation that was keeping them from participating in what felt increasingly like a public humiliation. That's when the youngest boy, the one who appeared to be around 7, broke away from his mother's protective hand and walked a few steps toward the crowd. He was small for his age, with light brown hair that had been carefully combed for this important day, wearing what were obviously his best clothes, pants that were slightly too large, and a shirt that had been pressed with particular care. He stopped after just a few steps and looked up at the assembled adults with an expression of pure confusion. "Mama," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Why won't anyone help us?" The question hit the gathering like a physical blow. I saw several people turn away, unable to meet the child's eyes. Others studied their hands or suddenly found urgent business to attend to elsewhere. The boy's mother moved quickly to bring him back to the family group, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, highlighting the cruel absurdity of the entire proceeding. Wallace cleared his throat and continued with the auction, but his professional demeanor was cracking. $25,000, he called. "This property must be sold today to satisfy court orders. Do I hear 25,000? The father, I still didn't know his name, though I would learn later that he was James Henderson, formerly Staff Sergeant Henderson of the 82nd Airborne, stepped forward slightly and spoke for the first time since emerging from the courthouse. "Sir," he said, addressing Wallace directly, "if no one bids, what happens to my family?" The directness of the question, the quiet dignity with which it was asked, and the terrible vulnerability it revealed struck me with unexpected force. Wallace looked down at his papers, clearly uncomfortable with having to answer. "Mr. Henderson," he replied, "the court will take possession of the property regardless. If the final bid doesn't cover your outstanding obligations, you'll remain responsible for the difference. The county will make arrangements for temporary housing while you transition to new circumstances." The euphemisms were painful to hear. Temporary housing likely meant a homeless shelter, possibly in the larger city 2 hours away. Transition to new circumstances meant the complete disruption of these children's lives, their education, their stability, their sense of security and belonging. 8 people would be scattered to whatever resources existed for families in crisis, and those resources were notoriously inadequate in rural counties like Millfield. Mrs. Henderson, later I would learn her name was Catherine, though everyone called her Katie, pulled the 7-year-old closer and spoke quietly to the oldest girl. I couldn't hear what she said, but the girl nodded solemnly and shifted the toddler to her other arm. The family was preparing for the worst while maintaining their dignity in the face of public catastrophe. 20,000, Wallace called, his voice now barely concealing his discomfort with the entire proceeding. "Do I hear $20,000? That's when something inside me shifted entirely. I had come here to make a routine business acquisition, to add another piece to my growing agricultural empire. I had the resources to bid any amount necessary to secure the property. But somewhere between watching that 7-year-old boy ask why no one would help his family and hearing the auctioneer reduce their life's work to increasingly desperate price points, the nature of the transaction had changed completely. I raised my hand. $50,000. My voice cut through the morning silence like a blade through fabric. Every head in the crowd turned toward me, and I could feel the weight of their stares as Wallace Griffith looked up from his papers with undisguised relief. "We have 50,000 from Mr. Blackwood," he announced, his professional composure returning instantly. "Do I hear 55? The Henderson family remained frozen, in their positions at the bottom of the courthouse steps. James Henderson's grip on that folded paper had tightened even further, if such a thing were possible, while Katie's hand moved protectively to rest on the shoulder of another child. The oldest girl, holding the toddler, turned slightly in my direction, her eyes wide with something between hope and disbelief. Maxwell Sterling stepped closer to me, his voice barely audible. "Thomas, are you certain about this? Once you start bidding, you're committed to follow through." But I wasn't thinking about commitment or business strategy anymore. I was thinking about that 7-year-old boy's question echoing across the courthouse. Steps. About the way the toddler had nestled trustingly against his sister's shoulder, about the military ribbons on James Henderson's jacket that spoke of service and sacrifice while his family faced homelessness. 50,000 going at once, Wallace called, scanning the crowd for competing bids that clearly weren't coming. 50,000 going twice. 60,000, I said, louder this time. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. This was no longer about covering the Henderson family's debt. I had already bid more than enough for that. This was about something else entirely, though I wasn't yet sure what that something was. Wallace nodded briskly. "We have $60,000. Do I hear 65? The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less tense, more expectant. The other potential bidders seemed to understand that something unusual was happening here, that this had moved beyond the realm of ordinary property acquisition into territory none of them wanted to navigate. 60,000 going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Thomas Blackwood for $60,000. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. James Henderson's shoulders sagged slightly, whether from relief or resignation I couldn't tell. Katie pulled the 7-year-old closer and whispered something to him that made him nod solemnly. The oldest girl shifted the toddler again, and for the first time since I'd seen them, allowed herself to look directly at me. What happened next surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of the typical post-auction dispersal where buyers handled paperwork and sellers quietly departed, I found myself walking down those courthouse steps toward the Henderson family. Maxwell called my name from behind, probably wanting to discuss immediate legal requirements or transfer procedures, but I ignored him. James Henderson straightened as I approached, falling automatically into the sort of attention posture that never fully leaves someone with military training. His eyes met mine directly, and I saw intelligence there, dignity, and a wariness that suggested he'd learned not to trust unexpected kindness. "Mr. Henderson," I said, extending my hand, "I'm Thomas Blackwood." He shook my hand with a firm grip, calloused from years of physical work. "James Henderson, this is my wife Katie, and these are our children." Katie stepped forward, still keeping the younger children close. "Mr. Blackwood, we want to thank you. We know you didn't have to—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. "Where will you go now?" I asked, and immediately regretted the directness of the question. It sounded harsh, almost accusatory, when what I meant was concern. James and Katie exchanged a look that spoke of conversations held in whispers after children were asleep, plans made, and unmade as options disappeared one by one. "We have some possibilities," James said carefully. "Katie's sister lives in Denver. She's offered to help until we can get back on our feet." But something in his voice told me this wasn't really a plan, so much as a desperate hope. Denver was 8 hours away by car, if they had a car that could make such a journey. Katie's sister might have offered help, but housing 8 additional people, even temporarily, would strain any household. And James would be leaving behind everything he'd built here, all his local connections and knowledge, to start over in a city where his agricultural experience might count for nothing. The oldest girl, I later learned her name was Rebecca, spoke for the first time. "Papa, what about school?" Her voice carried the particular worry of a teenager who understood that disruption at her age could affect college applications, scholarship opportunities, her entire future trajectory. "We'll figure it out, Becca," Katie said softly, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath her reassurance. That's when I made the second decision that would change everything. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "would you and your family be willing to stay on the property? As for my employees..." The words surprised me even as I spoke them. I hadn't planned this offer, hadn't considered the implications or worked out the details. But seeing this family preparing to scatter to uncertain futures while their knowledge and experience disappeared from land they'd worked for years seemed like a waste of resources that went beyond mere economics. James stared at me for a long moment. "I'm not sure I understand what you're offering." "I need a property manager for this land," I continued, the plan forming as I spoke. "Someone who knows the soil, the water sources, the seasonal patterns. You've been working this land for how long?" 12 years, James replied automatically. 12 years of knowledge about 300 acres. That's worth something significant. I'm offering you the position of property manager, with housing provided. Your family stays in the house, your children stay in their schools, and you help me integrate this land into my operation." Katie's hand went to her throat, a gesture of surprise or hope or disbelief. The twins, I hadn't yet learned their names, were David and Daniel, looked up at their parents with expressions that suggested they'd learned not to expect good news, but were desperately hoping for it anyway. "What would the position entail?" James asked, his military training evident in the way he approached this unexpected opportunity. Even in a crisis, he was gathering intelligence, assessing the situation, trying to understand what was really being offered. "Initially teaching me everything you know about this property. Long-term, helping me expand operations across all my holdings. I have 4 other properties in the region, and I've been looking for someone with your experience to help coordinate improvements and expansion." This wasn't entirely fabricated. I had been considering hiring additional management, though I hadn't specifically planned to offer such a position to the Henderson family until this moment. But as I spoke, I realized the offer made practical sense. James clearly understood agriculture and land management. His military background suggested reliability, attention to detail, ability to work under pressure, and keeping the family intact and stable would benefit everyone involved. Maxwell had approached during this conversation, though he remained at a respectful distance. I could see from his expression that he was rapidly calculating legal implications, tax considerations, employment, law requirements. As my attorney, it was his job to identify potential complications before they became actual problems. "There would need to be a formal employment contract," I added, nodding toward Maxwell. "Salary, benefits, clear job descriptions, everything legal and above board." "Mr. Blackwood," Katie said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," I replied. "Take some time to discuss it as a family, but understand that this isn't charity. I'm offering a job to someone whose qualifications I respect. With housing as part of the compensation package, you'd be earning your position here." The distinction was important, for their dignity as much as for practical reasons. This couldn't be seen as a handout or temporary assistance. It had to be a legitimate business arrangement that benefited both parties, or it wouldn't work long-term for anyone involved. Rebecca shifted the toddler again. I would soon learn his name was Michael, and spoke quietly to her parents. "Mama, could we really stay? Could I finish high school here?" The hope in her voice was painful to hear. She was at an age where stability mattered enormously, where disruption could affect not just her immediate circumstances, but her entire future. Staying would mean maintaining her friendships, her academic record, her involvement in whatever activities and organizations she'd built her high school experience around. James looked at his wife, then at his children, then back at me. "Mr. Blackwood, assuming we could work out the details, when would you need an answer?" "Take whatever time you need," I said. "But if you're agreeable, there's no reason you couldn't move back into the house this evening." The foreclosure transfer doesn't require you to vacate immediately if you're staying as employees rather than displaced owners. This was partially true. The legal mechanics would be more complex than I was suggesting, but Maxwell could handle those complications. What mattered was that this family didn't need to spend another night in uncertainty, didn't need to load their children into whatever vehicle they had and drive 8 hours to impose on relatives who might not be prepared for such a large influx of house guests. "Could we have an hour," Katie asked, "to talk it over as a family?" "Of course," I replied. "Maxwell and I will handle the paperwork for the property transfer. When you're ready, you can find us inside the courthouse." The Henderson family moved away from the courthouse steps toward a small park across the street, where they arranged themselves on benches and began what was clearly an intense family discussion. I watched them for a moment, James and Katie, speaking quietly, while the older children listened carefully and the younger ones played nearby, under Rebecca's watchful supervision. It was a family meeting about their future, conducted in public because they had no private space available, but handled with the same careful attention they would have given it in their own living room. Maxwell and I climbed the courthouse steps to begin dealing with the immediate legal requirements. As we walked, he began outlining the complications I was creating for myself. "Thomas, you realize this arrangement opens you to significant liability issues? Employment law, housing regulations, potential family conflicts that could affect business, operations. If something goes wrong with this family situation, it could impact all your properties." He wasn't wrong. Mixing business relationships with personal circumstances always created potential for complications. If James Henderson proved to be unreliable or incompetent, I'd have to terminate both his employment and his family's housing simultaneously. If there were family problems, illness, behavioral issues with the children, marital difficulties, they could spill over into business operations, and if the arrangement didn't work out for any reason, I'd be responsible for displacing 8 people who had already lost their home once. "What would you recommend for structuring the employment contract?" I asked, focusing on practical solutions rather than potential problems. "Standard probationary period, probably 6 months. Clear job descriptions with measurable performance metrics. Housing provided as part of compensation, but with specified terms for what happens if employment terminates, and definitely separate contracts for the property management role versus any additional responsibilities you mentioned." As we entered the courthouse to begin paperwork processing, I caught sight of the Henderson family through the window. The 7-year-old who had asked why no one would help them was now playing with Michael, the toddler, while the older children continued their serious discussion with their parents. Rebecca had set the baby down on the grass and was helping him take a few wobbling steps, her face lit with the kind of genuine smile I hadn't seen from any of them during the morning's proceedings. That image, a teenage girl helping her baby brother learn to walk, while their family discussed whether they could rebuild their lives, crystallized something for me. This wasn't about property acquisition or business expansion anymore. This was about providing stability for people who deserved better than the circumstances that had brought them to those courthouse steps. The paperwork took longer than expected. Property transfers always involve more documentation than seems reasonable, and this transaction had additional complications because of the foreclosure proceedings and the immediate employment arrangement we were putting in place. Maxwell had to coordinate with the court clerk, the county recorder, and the bank that had initiated the foreclosure. Meanwhile, I found myself periodically glancing out the window to check on the Henderson family's ongoing discussion. After about 45 minutes, I saw James stand up and shake hands with his oldest son. I would learn his name was Matthew, and he was 14, old enough to have opinions about his family's future that deserved consideration. Then James walked back toward the courthouse while the rest of the family remained in the park. He found us in the clerk's office, where Maxwell was reviewing the final transfer documents. "Mr. Blackwood," James said. "We'd like to accept your offer." Maxwell looked up from his papers, probably calculating how much additional legal work this decision was creating for him. "Excellent," I replied. "Maxwell, what do we need to do to make this official?" "I'll draft a basic employment agreement this afternoon," Maxwell said. "We can execute something more comprehensive later, but for immediate purposes, we need to establish the employment relationship formally before the family reoccupies the property." James nodded. "I understand. And, sir, I want you to know that we won't disappoint you. I know this is unusual circumstances, but we're good people and hard workers." The slight defensiveness in his voice told me he understood how this situation might look to outside observers. A foreclosed family, immediately rehired to manage the same property they'd just lost, could appear to be an elaborate charade, a way of circumventing the legal consequences of their financial failure. But I had seen enough during the morning's proceedings to believe this was a family worth investing in, worth taking a chance on. "I'm confident in my decision," I told him. "Let's make this work for everyone involved." As we completed the final paperwork, I began to understand that buying the Henderson property had been the easy part. The real challenge would be navigating the complex human dynamics I'd just committed myself to, helping this family rebuild their lives while building a business relationship that served both our interests. But watching James Henderson's shoulders straighten as he signed the employment agreement, seeing the relief and determination in his expression, I felt certain it was the right choice. Outside the courthouse windows, Katie Henderson was helping the toddler take more steps on the grass while her other children played nearby, and for the first time that morning, they looked like a family with a future rather than refugees from a disaster. The territory would indeed be talking about what happened on those courthouse steps, but the story was just beginning. 3 weeks after the courthouse auction, everything changed again. What started as a local curiosity, wealthy rancher hires a family he just bought out of foreclosure, had somehow transformed into a national news story. I first realized the scope of what was happening when I arrived at my office that Tuesday morning to find 17 missed calls on my business line and a parking lot full of vehicles I didn't recognize. My secretary, Eleanor Walsh, met me at the door with an expression somewhere between panic and excitement. She'd worked for me for 8 years, handling everything from cattle buyers to agricultural inspectors, but nothing had prepared her for the scene unfolding outside Blackwood Ranch headquarters. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, clutching a stack of message slips thick enough to choke a horse. "There are reporters here, from Denver, from Salt Lake City, and I think one woman said she drove up from Phoenix overnight. They all want to talk to you about the Henderson family." Through my office windows, I could see them setting up equipment on my property. Cameras on tripods, a woman in a bright red blazer talking into a microphone while pointing toward the main ranch building, a man with an enormous telephoto lens, taking pictures of everything from my cattle to my mailbox. "How did they find out about this?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I suspected I knew the answer. Eleanor confirmed my suspicions. "Apparently someone recorded the whole courthouse auction on their phone, posted it online with some kind of caption about Millionaire, saves American family. It's been shared thousands of times since yesterday. The modern world's capacity for turning private moments into public entertainment never ceased to amaze me. What had been a spontaneous decision to help a family in crisis had been transformed into content for strangers to consume and judge. I thought about James and Katie Henderson, who were probably dealing with their own invasion of unwanted attention, and felt a surge of protective anger. "What do the reporters want specifically?" I asked. "Interviews, mostly." The woman from Channel 7 in Denver says she wants to do a segment about compassionate capitalism. Someone from a magazine called Modern Rancher wants to feature you in their next issue. And there's a man outside who claims he's from some national morning show, though I can't confirm that. This was exactly the kind of attention I'd spent my entire career avoiding. My business succeeded because I made smart decisions quietly, without fanfare or publicity. I bought properties when others couldn't see their potential, invested in improvements that paid off over time, and built relationships based on competence rather than celebrity. The last thing I needed was to become some kind of folk hero for doing what any decent person should have done. But as I watched the media circus setting up outside my office, I realized this situation was bigger than my personal preferences. Whatever story these reporters told would affect not just me, but the Henderson family. James was trying to establish credibility as my property manager while dealing with the scrutiny of being the rescued family. Katie was managing 6 children, while living under the microscope of public attention. Rebecca was attempting to finish her senior year of high school while being photographed every time she walked to the school bus. Eleanor handed me the morning newspaper, the Millfield County Herald, our local weekly that usually focused on cattle, prices, and high school football scores. The headline stretched across the entire front page: "Local rancher's heartwarming gesture saves family of 8." Below it was a photograph of the Henderson family standing on the courthouse steps, taken moments after I'd won the auction. James had his arm around Katie's shoulders, and Rebecca was holding baby Michael, while the other children clustered around their parents. They looked vulnerable and grateful and entirely unprepared for the attention this image would generate. The article itself was well-intentioned but problematic. It portrayed me as a selfless benefactor, and the Hendersons as grateful recipients of charity, completely missing the business relationship we'd actually established. James was described as a struggling veteran farmer, rather than the competent property manager I'd hired. The children were characterized as having been saved from homelessness, rather than members of a family that was rebuilding through employment opportunity. "Sir," Eleanor said quietly, "there's something else. The Henderson property, their house, it's surrounded too. Mrs. Henderson called about an hour ago. She's afraid to let the younger children play outside because of all the cameras." That decided it. Whatever media management I needed to do to protect this family's privacy, I would do. But first, I needed to talk to James and Katie about how we were going to handle this unexpected complication. I drove to their house. It still felt strange to think of it as their house again, though legally it was now mine, taking back roads to avoid the reporters camped outside my office. The Henderson property sat in a small valley about 3 miles from the main ranch headquarters, surrounded by rolling hills that provided natural barriers to casual observation. But as I crested the hill overlooking their house, I could see that those barriers hadn't been sufficient to deter determined journalists. At least 6 vehicles were parked along the gravel road leading to the house. People with cameras and notebooks were positioned strategically around the property, and I could see more equipment being unloaded from a van with satellite dishes mounted on its roof. The Henderson family had become prisoners in their own home, afraid to step outside because of the media attention they'd never asked for. I parked behind the house and entered through the kitchen door, which Katie had left unlocked for me. The family was gathered in their living room, but the curtains were drawn, and the atmosphere felt more like a siege than a normal morning in a ranch house. James stood when I entered, his military bearing evident in the way he automatically came to attention. But I could see the stress in his face, the tension around his eyes that came from trying to protect his family while dealing with circumstances beyond his control. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "I'm sorry about all this. We never expected—" "This isn't your fault," I interrupted, "and it's not something any of us could have predicted, but we need to figure out how to handle it together." Katie was sitting on the couch with Michael on her lap, while the other children arranged themselves around the room in various states of curiosity and concern. Rebecca looked embarrassed, as only a teenager can when unwanted attention disrupts her carefully constructed sense of normalcy. The twins appeared fascinated by the drama unfolding around them, pressing their faces to the window to peer through gaps in the curtains at the reporters outside. Matthew sat in a corner chair, reading a book with the determined concentration of someone trying to ignore chaos through sheer force of will. "They've been out there since dawn," Katie said, "taking pictures every time one of us moves past a window. Rebecca missed her school bus because we were afraid to let her walk to the road. Has anyone tried to approach the house directly?" I asked. "One woman knocked on the front door around 8 o'clock, James replied. "Said she was from some cable news network, wanted to interview the whole family about our inspiring story of American resilience. I told her we weren't interested, but she just smiled and said she'd wait." The 7-year-old, whose name I'd learned was Christopher, spoke up from his position next to his mother. "Papa, why do all those people want to take our picture?" It was an innocent question that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. This family had been thrust into the public eye, not because they'd sought attention or done anything newsworthy, but because a moment of private crisis had been transformed into public entertainment. "Sometimes, Chris," Katie said gently, "when something good happens, people want to tell others about it, but they don't always understand that families need privacy too." Rebecca looked up from her position near the window. "Mr. Blackwood, at school yesterday, kids kept asking me questions about whether we're really poor, whether you're really rich, whether this is all some kind of publicity stunt. I didn't know what to tell them. The impact on the children was what bothered me most about this situation. They were old enough to understand that they'd become objects of curiosity and sympathy, but too young to have developed the emotional tools to handle that kind of scrutiny. Rebecca was dealing with teenage social dynamics, complicated by her family's sudden notoriety. The younger children were confused by the attention, but unable to understand why their normal routines had been disrupted. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, settling into a chair where I could see all the family members. "First, I'm going to talk to one reporter, just one, and give them enough information to satisfy the media's curiosity without turning your lives into ongoing entertainment. I'll make it clear that you're employees, not charity cases, and that you deserve the same privacy as any other working family." James nodded approvingly. "That makes sense. Control the narrative by getting ahead of it. Second," I continued, "I'm going to hire security for the property. Not anything dramatic or intimidating, just someone to keep reporters and photographers at a respectful distance. You shouldn't have to live like prisoners because people are curious about your situation." "Is that really necessary?" Katie asked. "We don't want to seem ungrateful or like we're putting on airs." "It's necessary," I said firmly. "You have 6 children who need to be able to play outside, go to school, live normal lives. That's not possible with cameras pointed at your house 24 hours a day." The twins had abandoned their window watching and were now listening intently to our conversation. David, or possibly Daniel, I still had trouble telling them apart, raised his hand like he was in school. "Mr. Blackwood," he said when I nodded to him, "are we famous now?" "You're temporarily interesting to some people," I replied carefully. "But fame isn't something that just happens to you. It's something people choose to pursue. You're a normal family that went through a difficult time and came out stronger. That's worth celebrating, but it's not worth turning your lives upside down." Matthew looked up from his book. "Will this affect our father's job? If people think this whole arrangement is just for show?" It was a perceptive question from a 14-year-old, and it highlighted one of my biggest concerns about the media attention. If the public narrative focused on charity and rescue rather than legitimate employment, it could undermine James's credibility as a property manager and create problems for our working relationship. "That's exactly why I need to talk to the media," I said, "to make sure people understand that your father was hired because of his qualifications, not because I felt sorry for your family. He's been managing this land successfully for 12 years. That experience is valuable, regardless of the circumstances that led to our employment arrangement. James straightened in his chair. Sir, I want you to know that we're committed to proving ourselves through work, not through gratitude. This family doesn't want to be anybody's feel-good story. We want to earn our place here. I know that, I replied, and that's exactly what I'll tell anyone who's interested in listening. Eleanor called my cell phone while we were still discussing media strategy. The situation outside my office had escalated significantly. More news crews had arrived, including what appeared to be a satellite truck from one of the major networks. Local police had been called to manage traffic and keep reporters off private property. And my business phone was ringing so constantly that Eleanor had stopped answering it. Sir, she said, I think you need to make a statement soon, before this gets even more out of hand. People are starting to show up who aren't reporters, just curious locals and some folks who drove here from other counties to see what all the invuce is about. The Millfield County Sheriff, Bobby Ramirez, had also called. He was concerned about the impact on local traffic and resources, and he'd heard rumors that some national media outlets were sending larger crews. What had started as a human interest story was threatening to become a genuine disruption to the community. I told the Henderson family I'd be back later to check on them and drove to my office to deal with the media circus. The scene that greeted me was even more chaotic than I'd expected. The parking lot and surrounding areas were crowded with news vehicles, photographers, and what appeared to be several dozen curious onlookers. Someone had set up a small concession stand to sell coffee and breakfast burritos to the assembled crowd, turning my property into an impromptu festival. Maxwell Sterling was waiting for me inside the office, having somehow managed to navigate through the crowd without being intercepted by reporters. Thomas, he said as soon as I walked in, we need to discuss the legal implications of all this attention. If you're going to make public statements about the Henderson family's employment, we need to be very careful about how you characterize the arrangement. What kind of legal implications? Privacy laws, employment regulations, potential claims from other parties. If the media attention affects the family negatively, or if your statements create unrealistic expectations about your business practices, it could lead to lawsuits or regulatory scrutiny. Maxwell's caution was understandable, but I was more concerned about the immediate human impact than potential legal complications. The Henderson family was dealing with unwanted attention that was disrupting their children's lives and their ability to do the work I'd hired them to do. I'm going to give one interview, I told him. Something comprehensive enough to satisfy curiosity, but boring enough to discourage follow-up stories. I'll focus on the business aspects of the arrangement and emphasize that this is a normal employment situation, not an ongoing charity project. Let me review whatever questions they plan to ask before you agree to anything, Maxwell said, and we should prepare talking points in advance to make sure you don't inadvertently create problems. Through the office windows, I could see a reporter in the bright red blazer Eleanor had mentioned earlier. She was standing in front of a camera, gesturing toward the office building while speaking into a microphone. Behind her, other news crews were conducting their own segments, creating a scene that looked like election night coverage rather than a story about rural employment practices. My decision to help the Henderson family had created consequences. None of us had anticipated. What should have been a private business arrangement had become a public spectacle, affecting not just my life and theirs, but the entire community of Millfield County. The challenge now was managing the attention in a way that protected everyone involved while satisfying the media's appetite for content. But as I watched the circus unfolding outside my office, I couldn't help thinking about Christopher Henderson's innocent question, why do all those people want to take our picture? The answer was complicated and not entirely flattering to human nature, but it was something we'd all have to navigate together. The territory was indeed talking about what happened on those courthouse steps, but the conversation had grown far beyond anything I'd imagined when I raised my hand to bid on that property 3 weeks earlier. The media attention faded faster than it had appeared, but its effects lingered in ways none of us had anticipated. By the end of October, 6 weeks after the courthouse auction, the news crews had moved on to other stories, and the reporters had returned to their regular beats. What remained was something more complex and harder to define. A relationship between my family and the Hendersons that had evolved beyond the boundaries of a simple employer-employee arrangement. It started with small things. Katie Henderson began leaving fresh bread on my kitchen counter twice a week, claiming she was testing recipes, but always making exactly enough for my household plus theirs. Rebecca started helping my housekeeper, Maria Santos, with tasks around my main house, refusing payment, but accepting college application fee money when I offered it as educational support for employee families. The younger Henderson children had begun treating my property as an extension of their own, playing in my barns and helping with minor ranch chores in ways that spoke of growing comfort and belonging. James proved to be everything I'd hoped for, as a property manager and more. His knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. He could tell me which sections held water longest during dry spells, where the soil was richest for different types of grazing, which fence lines needed reinforcement before winter. But beyond his technical expertise, he brought an organizational system that improved efficiency across all my holdings. Equipment was maintained better, schedules were coordinated more effectively, and problems were identified and solved before they became expensive emergencies. More importantly, he understood ranch culture in ways that some of my previous managers had not. He knew when to push workers and when to give them space, how to balance productivity with the reality that ranch work was often dependent on weather and animal behavior. The men who worked for me respected him quickly, drawn to his military bearing, but appreciating his willingness to work alongside them rather than simply issuing orders from an office. But as our professional relationship deepened into something approaching friendship, I began to notice things that troubled me. Small inconsistencies in stories about their past. Moments when Katie would stop speaking mid-sentence if certain topics arose. The way Rebecca would change the subject whenever anyone asked about their life before coming to Montana. And most concerning, the way all the Henderson children would freeze whenever a car they didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. The first real warning sign came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the family physician in Millfield, who had been treating Michael Henderson for routine childhood ailments, called me on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. She'd never contacted me directly before, and her voice carried a tension that immediately put me on alert. "Mr. Blackwood," she said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about the Henderson family. There are some medical concerns that I think you should be aware of, given your relationship with them." Medical privacy laws prevented her from sharing specific details over the phone, but she suggested we meet in person to discuss patterns she'd observed during the family's recent appointments. Her office was in downtown Millfield, a modest building that served most of the county's medical needs. When I arrived that evening after her regular hours, her expression was troubled in a way that made my stomach clench with anticipation. "Before we begin," Dr. Mitchell said, settling behind her desk, "I want you to understand that I'm not violating patient confidentiality. What I'm sharing with you consists of observations and concerns that relate to potential safety issues, which gives me some discretion in discussing the situation." She opened a folder containing what appeared to be medical records for all 6 Henderson children. "Mr. Blackwood, in the 3 months since this family has been your employees, I've treated them for various minor illnesses and injuries. Nothing Unusual individually, but taken together, the pattern is concerning. She spread several documents across her desk, pointing to entries highlighted in yellow. Michael Henderson, age 2, treated for what his mother described as a fall down stairs. Rebecca Henderson, treated for anxiety and sleep disturbances. Christopher Henderson, treated for what his parents called night terrors, but which present more like symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And Matthew Henderson, who came in alone last week, asking about counseling resources for a friend, but clearly meant himself. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. These children, who had seemed to be thriving in their new environment, were apparently carrying psychological trauma that hadn't been immediately visible. "What kind of trauma are we talking about?" I asked, though part of me already suspected. The answer. Dr. Mitchell leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "The symptoms I'm seeing are consistent with children who have witnessed domestic violence, possibly over an extended period. The sleep disturbances, the startle responses, the way they interact with authority figures, all suggest exposure to chronic stress and fear. Have you discussed this with James and Katie?" "I've tried." Mrs. Henderson deflects questions about family history and becomes visibly anxious when I probe for details about previous injuries or medical care. Mr. Henderson provides only the most basic information and changes the subject if I ask about the children's behavioral patterns. They're not being dishonest exactly, but they're clearly guarding information. This explained so much about the family's behavior that I'd attributed to the stress of foreclosure and relocation. The way the children stayed close to their parents, in public spaces, how quickly they obeyed instructions without question or negotiation, the way Rebecca seemed to carry responsibility for her younger siblings that went beyond typical teenage babysitting duties. "Dr. Mitchell, what would you recommend I do with this information?" "Monitor the situation carefully. These children need stability and safety, which you appear to be providing, but they also likely need professional counseling to address whatever trauma they experienced before coming here. And if there's any possibility that the source of that trauma could resurface." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. If James and Katie Henderson were fleeing from something or someone dangerous, that danger might eventually follow them to Montana, and if I was now responsible for this family's welfare, I needed to understand what I might be protecting them from. That conversation changed my perspective on everything I'd observed about the Henderson family. Behaviors I'd interpreted as gratitude or natural reserve took on darker implications. The family's reluctance to discuss their past wasn't just privacy, it was self-protection. Their quick adaptation to ranch life wasn't resilience. It was survival instinct. I drove home that evening with my mind racing, trying to decide how to approach this new information. I couldn't directly confront James and Katie without revealing that Dr. Mitchell had shared confidential observations. But I also couldn't ignore signs that these children needed help I wasn't qualified to provide. The opportunity to address the situation arose sooner than I expected. That Saturday morning, I found Matthew Henderson sitting alone in one of my barns, ostensibly cleaning equipment, but clearly lost in thought. At 14, he was old enough to understand adult complexities, but young enough to be vulnerable to them. His behavior over the past few weeks had been increasingly withdrawn, and I'd noticed him watching his parents with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was monitoring their emotional states. "Matthew," I said, settling onto a bale of hay nearby, "how are you adjusting to everything here? School, new friends, ranch work?" He looked up from the bridle he'd been polishing with unnecessary intensity. "It's good, sir. Everyone's been real welcoming. I like helping with the horses." But his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to reveal too much about his true feelings. "You know," I continued, "when I was your age, my family went through some difficult times too. It took me a while to trust that Things were really getting better, even after our situation improved. Matthew's hands stilled on the leather equipment. What kind of difficult times? My father had a drinking problem. Not violent exactly, but unpredictable. You never knew which version of him would come home each night. The fun dad who brought presents and told stories, or the angry dad who yelled about everything and made my mother cry. Even after he got sober, I kept waiting for things to go bad again. This wasn't entirely true. My childhood had been relatively stable, but Matthew needed to hear that someone understood the kind of hypervigilance that comes from living with chronic uncertainty. How did you stop waiting for things to go bad? He asked quietly. Time, mostly, and having adults around who proved they were reliable, but also talking to someone who understood what I'd been through. Matthew nodded slowly, then looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. Mr. Blackwood, can I ask you something? Of course. If a family had to leave somewhere because of danger and they came to a new place where they felt safe, would it be wrong to not talk about what happened before? The question confirmed Dr. Mitchell's suspicions while revealing the burden this young man was carrying. He was trying to protect his family's secrets while dealing with his own need to process whatever trauma they'd experienced. Matthew, I said carefully, keeping your family safe is never wrong. But keeping trauma inside without talking to anyone about it can make healing harder. Sometimes the bravest thing is accepting help, even if it feels risky. What if talking about it could put your family in danger again? Then you find people you trust completely and you talk to them. People who care more about your family's safety than about their own curiosity. He was quiet for several minutes, continuing to work on the bridle while considering my words. Finally, he spoke again. My father. Our real father. He wasn't. A good man. We had to leave in the middle of the night, and we've been moving around for almost 3 years, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to find us. The admission hung in the air between us, and I could see the relief and terror in Matthew's expression as he spoke his family's truth out loud for what might have been the first time. Where is your real father now? I asked gently. We don't. No. Mama says he's probably still looking for us. He told her once that he'd never let us go, that we belonged to him forever. That's why we keep using different names, why we never stay anywhere very long. Different names. This explained the inconsistencies I'd noticed, the way family members sometimes hesitated before responding to what I'd assumed were their real names. Matthew, what's your real last name? He looked around the barn as if checking for eavesdroppers, then whispered, Sullivan. We're the Sullivan family. James Sullivan is my father, but he's not. The other man isn't my real father. He married our mother when I was little, and he adopted us all legally. That's how he could keep us even when Mama tried to leave before. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture far more complex and dangerous than I'd imagined. This wasn't just a family that had fallen on hard times. This was a family in hiding, using assumed identities to escape from an abusive situation that had apparently lasted for years. Matthew, does your father, James, know that you're telling me this? No, sir. He and Mama, they're trying to protect us by not talking about it, but I think not talking is hurting us too. Rebecca has nightmares every night. Christopher wets the bed sometimes, even though he's 7. The twins act like everything's fine, but they won't sleep in separate beds anymore. Each detail painted a clearer picture of children traumatized by experiences no child should endure. But it also raised urgent questions about the family's safety and my own role in protecting them. Matthew, I want you to know that whatever your family's situation is, you're safe here. But I also think your parents need to know that you've shared this information with me. They deserve the chance to decide how much they want to tell me about your past. You won't make us leave. The fear in his voice was heartbreaking. Here was a boy who'd found stability and safety for the first time in years. terrified that honesty would cost his family their sanctuary. "I won't make you leave," I promised, "but I might be able to help in ways I can't now, if I understand what we're dealing with. Sometimes adults need help too, even when they're trying to handle everything on their own." That evening, I asked James and Katie to meet with me privately after the children were in bed. We sat around their kitchen table, the same one where they'd probably made the decision to accept my job offer months earlier. But the atmosphere was entirely different now, heavier with unspoken truths and the knowledge that our relationship was about to change fundamentally. "James, Katie," I began, "I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Matthew today, and then I think we need to have an honest discussion about your family's situation." Katie's face went pale immediately, and James straightened in his chair with the alertness of someone preparing for combat. "What did Matthew tell you?" Katie asked, her voice barely audible. "Enough for me to understand that you're not who you've been pretending to be, and that you have good reasons for the deception." James and Katie looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way that couples develop over years of shared challenges. Then James spoke. "Mr. Blackwood, we never intended to lie to you, but we couldn't risk—" "I understand," I said, "and I'm not angry about the false identities or the incomplete information. I'm concerned about whether you're truly safe here and whether there's anything I should know about potential threats to your family." Katie started crying quietly, not the dramatic tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the exhausted weeping of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "We thought we'd finally found somewhere we could stop running," she whispered. "The children were starting to feel normal again. But if you know the truth, then maybe others will figure it out too." "Katie," I said gently, "knowing the truth doesn't mean I'm going to broadcast it. It means I can help protect you more effectively, but I need to understand what we're protecting you from." And so, sitting around that kitchen table as snow began to fall outside, James and Katie Sullivan began to tell me the real story of how their family had ended up on those courthouse steps and why they'd been running from something much more dangerous than financial troubles. The snow fell steadily outside the kitchen windows as James and Katie Sullivan began to unravel 3 years of carefully constructed lies. What emerged was a story so dark and complex that I understood immediately why they'd chosen deception over honesty, why they'd been willing to live as refugees rather than risk telling anyone the truth about their past. Katie spoke first, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "His name is Marcus Thornfield. He's Rebecca's biological father, and legally he's the adoptive father of all our children. When we married 8 years ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Successful businessman, charming, generous, everything I'd dreamed of for myself and Rebecca." She paused, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. James reached over to cover her hands with his own, a gesture of support that spoke of countless similar conversations, held in whispers and darkness. "Marcus owns a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Southwest," James continued. "Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, Las Vegas. On paper, he's a pillar of the community, sponsors youth sports teams, donates to charities, serves on the board of directors for 3 different non-profits. But behind closed doors—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Katie picked up the thread. "The abuse started small. Criticism about my appearance, my parenting, my intelligence. Then came the isolation. He convinced me to quit my job, move away from my family, cut ties with friends who didn't understand our lifestyle. By the time I realized what was happening, I was completely dependent on him financially and emotionally. This pattern was familiar from domestic violence cases I'd read about, but hearing it described by someone who'd lived through it brought the reality into sharp focus. Abusers didn't announce their intentions. They built prisons 1 bar at a time until their victims couldn't see a way out. "What about the children?" I asked gently. Katie's face crumpled with guilt and pain. He was different with them initially. Strict, but not cruel. I told myself that his demands for perfection, his anger when they made normal childhood mistakes, were just high standards. But as they got older, especially Rebecca, she couldn't continue. James took over, his military training evident in the way he compartmentalized emotion to deliver essential information. Marcus began showing inappropriate interest in Rebecca when she turned 12. Nothing overtly sexual at first, just excessive. Attention to her appearance, comments about her developing body, rules about clothing that became increasingly restrictive. When Katie tried to intervene, he convinced her she was being paranoid, jealous of the attention he paid to her daughter. The picture they were painting made my skin crawl. A predator with legal authority over 6 children, financial resources, to avoid consequences, and the social standing to make any accusations against him seem incredible. How did James fit into this situation? I asked, looking at the man who'd introduced himself as James Henderson, but whose real story was clearly far more complicated. Katie managed a weak smile, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her since this conversation began. James was my salvation, though neither of us intended it that way. He was a staff sergeant stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base outside Tucson. His unit was participating in a community outreach program that Marcus's dealership sponsored. They met at a charity event, and James started coming around to help with yard work and home repairs that Marcus was always too busy to handle. I could see what was happening, James said quietly, the way Katie jumped when Marcus raised his voice, how the kids scattered whenever his car pulled into the driveway, the way Rebecca had started dressing in baggy clothes and avoiding eye contact with adult men. But Katie was married and I was military. Couldn't you just do what? I prompted. Couldn't just accuse a prominent civilian of domestic abuse without proof. And even if I'd had proof, Marcus had money and lawyers and connections. A soldier making accusations against a respected businessman wouldn't have been believed. Katie leaned forward, her voice gaining strength as she continued the story. James never said anything directly, but he started finding reasons to be around more often. Volunteering to pick up the kids from school when I couldn't. Offering to help with homework when Marcus was traveling. The children began to relax around him in ways they hadn't around any adult man since Marcus entered our lives. When did the situation escalate? I asked, sensing we were approaching the crisis that had ultimately forced them to flee. James and Katie exchanged another look, and I could see them deciding how much detail to share. Katie nodded slightly, giving James permission to continue. Last year, Rebecca came to me, James said. She was 13, and Marcus had started touching her. Nothing that left physical evidence, nothing that would hold up in court, but enough to terrify her. She begged me not to tell her mother because she was afraid it would make things worse for everyone. The rage that filled me at this revelation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The thought of a man using his position of authority to abuse a child, then leveraging that child's fear to ensure silence, made me want to drive to Arizona and settle the matter permanently. What did you do? I managed to ask. I convinced Rebecca to tell her mother, James replied, and when Katie confronted Marcus, he denied everything. Called Rebecca a troubled teenager seeking attention. Threatened to have her committed to a psychiatric facility if she continued making false accusations against him. Katie's voice was barely audible now. That's when I knew we had to leave, but Marcus had anticipated that possibility. He'd been monitoring my communications, tracking my movements, controlling our finances so completely that I didn't even have access to cash for groceries without his permission. And legally, all 6 children were his. If I tried to take them, and he reported them as kidnapped, you'd be fugitives, I finished, and the children would be returned to him. Exactly. So we planned carefully. James had been deployed overseas. twice during his time at Davis-Monthan, and he was scheduled for another deployment to Afghanistan. Instead of reporting for duty, he went AWOL. We staged a car accident to explain why I was hospitalized and couldn't care for the children temporarily. James took them, supposedly to his family in another state, while I recovered. The complexity of their escape plan was impressive, but the cost was enormous. James had destroyed his military career and become a federal fugitive. Katie had abandoned her entire identity. The children had been forced to leave behind friends, schools, everything familiar in their lives. "How long have you been running?" I asked. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Katie said without hesitation. "We've lived in 12 different states, used 14 different sets of identities, never stayed anywhere longer than 6 months, until we came here." "What made Montana different?" James answered this time. "Desperation, mostly. We were running out of money, running out of options. The fake documents cost thousands of dollars each time we had to change identities. The children were suffering from the constant upheaval. Rebecca was having panic attacks. The twins were acting out. Christopher had stopped speaking for 3 months. When we saw the foreclosure notice for the Henderson property," Katie continued, "it seemed like a sign. A family with children our kids' ages, a property isolated enough to provide some security, a community small enough that we might blend in, but large enough that strangers weren't automatically suspicious. You assumed the Henderson family's identity?" "We paid them," James said firmly. $20,000 for the right to use their names and basic information. They were headed to Canada anyway. The husband had work lined up in Alberta, and they were eager to start fresh. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we could establish ourselves and create new permanent identities. The ethics of identity. Theft aside, I had to admire the resourcefulness that had kept this family ahead of their pursuer for over 3 years. But I was also beginning to understand the enormous risks I'd unknowingly assumed by inserting myself into their situation. "James," I said carefully, "what's your current legal status with the military?" His face hardened. "Officially, I'm classified as a deserter. There's a warrant out for my arrest, though it's not actively pursued unless I surface in a way that attracts attention. The military has bigger problems than one missing staff sergeant, especially one without a history of disciplinary issues." "And the children's legal status?" Katie answered this question. "They're still legally Marcus's children. He filed missing persons reports when we disappeared, though he was careful to frame it as a kidnapping by an unstable mother and her accomplice. He's played the role of grieving father perfectly, hiring private investigators, offering rewards, appearing on local news programs, asking for help finding his stolen children." This revelation changed everything about the family's situation, and my own involvement in it. I wasn't just employing a family that had fallen on hard times. I was harboring federal fugitives and kidnapped children. However justified their actions might be morally, legally, we were all in serious jeopardy. "Has Marcus found you before?" I asked. "During the 3 years you've been running?" "Twice," James said grimly. "Once in Colorado, when Rebecca enrolled in a school that required too much documentation. We had to leave in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes we were wearing. The second time was in Nebraska, when someone recognized Katie from a missing persons flyer that Marcus had distributed at truck stops along major highways." "How close did he come to catching you?" Katie shuddered. "In Nebraska, we saw his car parked outside the motel where we'd been staying. We were coming back from buying groceries, and there it was, his distinctive red Corvette with Arizona plates. We kept driving and didn't stop until we reached the Wyoming border. The thought of this family living with that level of constant fear, never knowing if today would be the day their pursuer finally caught up with them, was almost unbearable. But it also raised a crucial question about our current situation. "Do you have any reason to believe Marcus knows you're in Montana?" I asked. James and Katie looked at each other again, and I could see the fear that they'd been suppressing throughout this conversation. "We don't know," Katie admitted. "The media attention after the courthouse auction. Our pictures were in newspapers, on television, all over social media. We tried to stay out of the coverage as much as possible, but there's no way." "To guarantee he didn't see it," I finished. "No," James said, "and if he did, he'll know exactly where to find us. Marcus is obsessive about anything relating to his property, and he considers us his property. He's also patient. He'll take time to plan his approach, figure out how to get the children back while making us look like the criminals." The implications of this possibility were staggering. If Marcus Thornfield had seen the media coverage and identified the Henderson family as his missing wife and children, he could already be making plans to reclaim them. With his financial resources and legal standing, he could potentially involve law enforcement, child protective services, even federal authorities, in his efforts to retrieve what he would frame as kidnapped children. "What would happen if he found you?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Katie's voice broke completely. "He told me once, during one of his rages, exactly what he would do if I ever tried to take his children away from him. He said he'd make sure I was declared mentally incompetent, that James would go to federal prison for kidnapping and desertion, and that the children would learn what real discipline looked like." "And Rebecca?" I asked quietly. Neither parent could answer this question, but their silence spoke volumes. A man who had sexually abused his stepdaughter and then been betrayed by her escape would likely exact terrible revenge if given the opportunity. "There's something else," James said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Marcus isn't just wealthy, he's connected. His business dealings have brought him into contact with people who don't ask questions about legal niceties. If official channels don't work to get his children back, he has other resources." The picture was becoming clearer and more terrifying by the minute. We weren't just dealing with a domestic abuser, we were dealing with someone who combined personal vindictiveness with financial resources and potentially criminal connections. "Why are you telling me all this now?" I asked. "You've kept these secrets for months. What's changed?" Katie wiped her eyes and looked directly at me. "Because the children are getting attached to this place, to you, to the idea that they might finally be safe. Matthew asked me last week if he could try out for the high school baseball team this spring. Rebecca has been researching colleges she might apply to from Montana. The twins have made friends at school for the first time in 3 years. They're putting down roots," James added, "and that terrifies us, because if we have to run again, it's going to destroy them. But if we stay and Marcus finds us—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the choice they were facing was clear. They could preserve their children's emotional well-being by staying in Millfield and building a life, but risk catastrophic consequences if their pursuer found them. Or they could protect their physical safety by running again, but sacrifice their children's chance at normal development and psychological healing. "There's one more thing you need to know," Katie said, her voice steadying with resolve. "We've made a decision as a family. If Marcus finds us here, we're not running again. The children can't take any more upheaval, and we can't keep living like fugitives forever. Whatever happens, this is where we make our stand." The weight of their trust in sharing this information was overwhelming. They were placing their families' safety, their children's futures, their very lives in my hands by revealing the truth about their situation. And they were asking me to help them prepare for a confrontation with someone who represented everything evil about abuse of power and authority. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that concealed the complexity of the human drama unfolding beneath it. But inside that kitchen, with 3 adults planning how to protect 6 children from a monster who had a legal claim to them, the stakes had never been clearer. The story that had begun with a simple property auction was revealing itself to be about much more than land or money or even basic human decency. It was about the lengths people would go to protect innocence, the price of standing up to evil, and the terrible choices that sometimes define our character when everything we value hangs in the balance. The morning after the Sullivan family's complete confession, I sat in my office before dawn, surrounded by documents that Maxwell Sterling had been gathering for the past 18 hours. What we'd discovered about Marcus Thornfield made the family's terror entirely justified and my own involvement far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Maxwell had arrived at my ranch at 6 a.m. with 3 thick folders and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept. As my attorney for over a decade, he'd handled complex business transactions and challenging legal situations, but nothing had prepared him for the research he'd conducted through the night. "Thomas," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "we need to discuss the legal reality of your situation before we go any further. What you've told me about this family places you in potential violation of federal kidnapping laws, harboring fugitives, conspiracy charges, and possibly accessory to child abduction. But they're protecting the children from abuse," I protested. "That's irrelevant from a legal standpoint," Maxwell replied grimly. "Marcus Thornfield has court orders establishing his legal custody of these children. The military has warrants for James Sullivan's arrest. Whatever moral justification exists for their actions, legally speaking, you're harboring federal fugitives and helping to conceal kidnapped minors." He opened the first folder, revealing printouts of news articles, business records, and what appeared to be legal documents spanning several years. Marcus Thornfield owns Thornfield Luxury Motors, a chain of high-end car dealerships across 4 states. Annual revenue exceeds $40 million. He employs over 300 people, sponsors multiple youth sports leagues, and has donated over $2 million to various charities in the past 5 years. On paper, he's a model citizen. Maxwell paused, opening the second folder. But when you dig deeper, patterns emerge. 5 different women have filed domestic violence complaints against him over the past 12 years. All 5 complaints were withdrawn before reaching trial. 3 of the women relocated to different states shortly after filing their complaints. 1 died in a car accident that police ruled suspicious but couldn't prove was anything other than tragic coincidence. The methodical way Maxwell presented this information couldn't disguise its horrifying implications. Marcus Thornfield wasn't just an abuser. He was a predator who had systematically silenced his victims through intimidation, financial pressure, or worse. "What about the missing persons case for the Sullivan family?" I asked. "Active in 4 states, with a $50,000 reward for information leading to the safe return of the children. Thornfield has hired 3 different private investigation firms, placed ads in newspapers across the western United States, and maintains a website dedicated to finding his kidnapped family. The FBI has classified it as a parental kidnapping case, though it's not their highest priority." Maxwell opened the third folder, revealing photographs that made my blood run cold. Pictures of James Sullivan in military uniform, clearly taken from official personnel files. Pictures of Katie and the children at various ages, including recent school photos that must have been taken during their time on the run. Most disturbing were surveillance-style photographs of locations where the family had apparently lived during their 3 years of hiding: motels, rental houses, temporary shelters. "He's been tracking them systematically," Maxwell continued. "These photos suggest he's maintained surveillance on their movements, possibly through private investigators or other resources. Some of these images were taken within weeks of the family's departure from each location." The realization that Marcus had been this close to recapturing the Sullivan family multiple times was terrifying. But it also raised an urgent question about our current situation. Maxwell, based on the media coverage from the Courthouse auction, how quickly could Thornfield identify and locate the family here? If he saw any of the television coverage or newspaper articles, immediately. The news stories included the family's assumed names, the location of your ranch, and enough background information to confirm their identities beyond any doubt. I felt the walls closing in around all of us. The very media attention I'd tried to manage to protect the family's privacy had potentially delivered them directly into the hands of their pursuer. "What are our options?" I asked. Maxwell closed the folders and leaned back in his chair. "Legally speaking, you have very few good options. You could contact authorities and cooperate with returning the children to their legal guardian. You could distance yourself from the family and claim ignorance of their true circumstances, or you could continue harboring them and accept the legal consequences when they're eventually discovered." "Those aren't really options," I said. "The first two result in those children being returned to an abuser. The third destroys my life but doesn't actually protect them long term. There is a fourth possibility," Maxwell said carefully, "but it's extremely risky and would require resources, planning, and a willingness to operate outside normal legal channels." "What kind of fourth possibility?" Maxwell glanced toward the door, ensuring we couldn't be overheard. "Thornfield's power comes from his legal standing, his financial resources, and his social connections. But all of that depends on maintaining his public image as a respectable businessman and grieving father. If that image were destroyed..." "You're talking about exposing him publicly?" "I'm talking about building a case so comprehensive and damaging that he'd be facing criminal charges rather than pursuing custody claims. But it would require evidence that currently doesn't exist, testimony from victims who have remained silent for years, and a coordinated effort to document patterns of abuse that he's successfully hidden." The implications of what Maxwell was suggesting were staggering. We would essentially be conducting our own investigation into Marcus Thornfield's crimes, gathering evidence that law enforcement agencies had apparently been unable or unwilling to collect, and building a case strong enough to neutralize his threat to the Sullivan family. "How would we even begin something like that?" I asked. "The women who filed those domestic violence complaints, if we could convince them to speak publicly, to provide detailed testimony about Thornfield's behavior, it might establish a pattern that would be difficult to dismiss. The private investigators he's hired might have records that reveal illegal surveillance or harassment. His business associates might have witnessed behavior that contradicts his public image." Maxwell pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what looked like an organizational chart. "The key would be coordinating multiple lines of investigation simultaneously while protecting the Sullivan family's location. If Thornfield realizes we're actively working against him, he might escalate his efforts to reclaim the children." "What kind of escalation?" "Based on his resources and apparent willingness to operate outside legal boundaries, anything from harassment and intimidation to physical violence. The man has already demonstrated that he views these children as his property and that he's willing to pursue them for years to reclaim them." Our conversation was interrupted by a knock on my office door. Eleanor Walsh entered, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "there's a man here to see you. Says he's from a law firm in Phoenix. Has some questions about your employment with the Henderson family." Maxwell and I exchanged a look that confirmed our worst fears. Less than 24 hours after learning the Sullivan family's complete story, Marcus Thornfield had apparently found them. "What's the man's name?" Maxwell asked. Eleanor consulted a business card. "Richard Pemberton, from Pemberton, Davis and Associates. He says it's regarding a missing persons case and child custody matter." Maxwell stood immediately. "Thomas, do not meet with this man without me present. If he's representing Thornfield, anything you say could be used to build a case." Against you for harboring fugitives. Should I tell him to leave? No, that might make things worse. Let me handle this conversation, and you listen carefully but say as little as possible. We followed Eleanor to the main reception area, where a man in an expensive suit was examining the photographs of ranch operations that decorated the walls. He was probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of polished appearance that suggested high-end legal representation. When he turned to greet us, his smile was professional but cold. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, extending his hand. "Richard Pemberton. Thank you for agreeing to see me on short notice." "Mr. Pemberton," Maxwell interjected before I could respond. "I'm Maxwell Sterling, Mr. Blackwood's attorney. Perhaps you could explain the purpose of your visit." Pemberton's smile widened slightly, suggesting he'd expected legal representation and was prepared for it. "Of course. I represent Marcus Thornfield, a businessman from Arizona whose wife and children have been missing for over 3 years. We have reason to believe that the family you know as the Hendersons may actually be Mr. Thornfield's missing relatives." "What makes you think that?" Maxwell asked. Pemberton opened a briefcase and withdrew several photographs, the same images Maxwell had shown me earlier, along with what appeared to be screenshots from the news coverage of our courthouse auction. "Physical resemblance is quite striking," Pemberton said, laying the photos on Eleanor's desk. "Additionally, the timeline of when this family arrived in your community corresponds with sightings of the missing family in neighboring states." I forced myself to examine the photographs objectively, as someone seeing them for the first time would. The resemblance between the Sullivans and the family described in the missing persons case was indeed unmistakable. Marcus Thornfield's private investigators had clearly been thorough in documenting the family's appearance and movements. "Mr. Pemberton," Maxwell said carefully, "are you suggesting that Mr. Blackwood's employees are not who they claim to be?" "I'm suggesting that they may be victims of kidnapping who are being held against their will by someone with military training and a history of violence. My client is naturally concerned for their safety and eager to have them return to their proper home." The way Pemberton characterized James Sullivan as someone with military training and a history of violence rather than a protective father revealed the narrative Marcus Thornfield was preparing to use. If the case became public, James would be portrayed as an unstable veteran who had kidnapped children and manipulated their mother, while Marcus would be the grieving father, desperate to reunite with his beloved family. "What exactly are you requesting from Mr. Blackwood?" Maxwell asked. "Simply an opportunity to speak with the family privately, to confirm their identities and ensure their well-being. If they are indeed the missing Thornfield family, my client would arrange for their safe return to Arizona. If they're not, we'll apologize for the confusion and continue our search elsewhere." The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could see the trap it represented. Once Marcus Thornfield, or his representatives, had direct access to the family, they could use any number of legal or extra-legal methods to force their return to Arizona. The children could be taken into protective custody while their kidnapping was investigated. Katie could be declared mentally incompetent and committed for psychological evaluation. James could be arrested on federal warrants and held while the children were processed through the system. "Mr. Pemberton," Maxwell said, "we'll need time to consider your request and consult with our clients. Could you provide us with documentation supporting your client's custody claims and contact information where we can reach you?" Pemberton smiled again, but this time the expression contained a hint of threat. "Of course, but I should mention that my client has been searching for his family for over 3 years. His patience is understandably limited, especially given the traumatic impact their disappearance has had on his emotional and physical health." He handed Maxwell a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents, custody orders, and medical Records. Everything you need to verify Mr. Thornfield's legitimate claim to these children is in there. I trust you'll review it promptly and respond within a reasonable time frame. What would you consider reasonable? Maxwell asked. 48 hours should be sufficient for you to confirm what we already know. After that, my client may need to involve federal authorities in resolving this matter. The threat was clear, though diplomatically phrased. We had 2 days to surrender the Sullivan family voluntarily, or Marcus Thornfield would escalate to involving FBI agents, federal marshals, and possibly armed law enforcement in reclaiming his kidnapped children. After Pemberton left, Maxwell and I retreated to my office to examine the documents he'd provided. What we found confirmed our worst fears about the legal realities of the Sullivan family's situation. The custody orders were legitimate, signed by an Arizona judge and filed through proper channels. Marcus Thornfield was indeed the legal adoptive father of all 6 children, with full parental rights and authority. The missing persons reports had been filed within days of the family's disappearance and remained active in federal databases. Most damaging were medical records indicating that Katie had been treated for psychiatric episodes and delusional behavior during the months before the family's disappearance. He's been planning this for years, Maxwell said, studying the documents. These medical records establish grounds for claiming that Katie was mentally incompetent when she fled with the children. If this reaches court, he'll argue that she was manipulated by James Sullivan and that the children need to be rescued from their kidnappers. What about evidence of abuse? Nothing in these files suggests any history of domestic violence or child abuse. Either the complaints I found earlier were sealed or dismissed, or Thornfield has been successful in keeping them out of any official records that would affect custody proceedings. The sophistication of Marcus Thornfield's legal strategy was terrifying. He had anticipated every possible defense the Sullivan family might use and had prepared documentation to counter their claims. If this case reached court, he would appear to be a loving father seeking to rescue his children from criminals, while they would appear to be fugitives who had kidnapped children and evaded law enforcement for 3 years. Maxwell, I said, what happens if we refuse to cooperate with Pemberton's request? Federal agents will arrive here within a week, probably with warrants for James Sullivan's arrest and court orders for the children's immediate return to Arizona. You'll be arrested as an accessory, and the children will be placed in protective custody while their rescue is processed through the system. And what happens if we cooperate? Maxwell's expression was grim. The same outcome, but faster and with less media attention. Either way, those children are going back to their abuser, unless we can fundamentally change the legal dynamics of this situation. How do we change the legal dynamics? By building a case against Thornfield that's so compelling it forces law enforcement to investigate him rather than pursuing the family. But we have less than 48 hours to accomplish something that should take months of careful investigation. Outside my office windows, I could see the Sullivan children playing in the snow, building snowmen and throwing snowballs with the kind of carefree joy that had been absent from their lives for 3 years. Rebecca was helping little Michael make snow angels, while Matthew and the twins engaged in an elaborate snowball fight. They looked like normal children having normal childhood experiences, completely unaware that their entire world was about to be destroyed once again. In less than 2 days, unless we could find a way to protect them, those children would be back in Marcus Thornfield's custody, and all of us who had tried to help them would be facing federal criminal charges. The investigation that might save them would require resources, connections, and a level of risk that could destroy everything I'd built over decades of careful business development. But watching those children play in the snow, knowing what awaited them if we failed, the choice was already made. Maxwell, I said, make whatever calls you need to make. We're going to war. 46 hours. That's how much time we had left. When everything changed, Maxwell had spent the night making calls to contacts across 4 states, former prosecutors, investigative journalists, victim advocacy groups, anyone who might have information about Marcus Thornfield that wasn't buried, under legal proceedings or sealed by non-disclosure agreements. Meanwhile, I'd been working with a different kind of resource. The network of ranchers, businessmen, and community leaders who'd built the modern West through handshake deals and mutual respect rather than legal contracts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, my housekeeper, had been quietly listening to our conversations about the Sullivan family's situation. Born in Phoenix 63 years ago, she'd lived through the city's transformation from desert outpost to major metropolitan area. More importantly, her extended family included 3 generations of women who'd worked in various service industries throughout Arizona. "Mr. Thomas," she said, approaching me as I sat in my kitchen at 5 a.m., reviewing documents Maxwell had gathered. "I need to tell you something about this man you're fighting." Maria rarely involved herself in my business affairs, preferring to maintain professional boundaries that had served us both well for 8 years. But something in her expression suggested she was about to cross those boundaries for reasons that went beyond normal employer-employee relationships. "My niece Carmen," she continued, settling into a chair across from me. "She worked at one of his car dealerships in Phoenix for 6 months, 2 years ago. She never told the family what happened there until last night, when I called her about your situation." Maria pulled out her cell phone and placed it on the table. "Carmen is willing to talk to your lawyer, but only if you can guarantee her protection. She has children of her own now, and she's terrified of what might happen if this man finds out she's spoken against him." Maxwell arrived 30 minutes later to take Carmen's call, and what we learned confirmed our worst suspicions about Marcus Thornfield while providing the first real evidence that might be used against him. Carmen Santos had witnessed Thornfield sexually harassing multiple female employees, using his position as owner to coerce women into compromising situations, and retaliating against anyone who complained by destroying their employment prospects throughout the Phoenix automotive industry. But more importantly, Carmen had documentation, photos taken secretly with her phone of bruises on co-workers who'd been disciplined by Thornfield, screenshots of text messages where he'd threatened employees who'd considered filing complaints, and most damaging, a recording of a conversation where Thornfield had explicitly described his philosophy about women and children as property that belonged to men with the power to control them. "This is exactly what we needed," Maxwell said, after completing the call. "But we need more. One witness, even with documentation, might not be enough to overcome 3 years of missing persons cases and federal kidnapping charges." That's when the second call came. This one from a source Maxwell had contacted through his legal network. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a child psychologist in Tucson, had been treating children from abusive families for over 20 years. She'd encountered Marcus Thornfield twice in professional settings and had been troubled enough by both interactions to document her concerns in private records. "Dr. Valdez can't testify about specific cases due to patient confidentiality," Maxwell explained after speaking with her, "but she can provide expert testimony about patterns of behavior she's observed. More importantly, she's willing to connect us with other professionals who've had similar experiences with Thornfield." By noon, we had testimony from 6 different women who'd worked for Thornfield's businesses, 3 child welfare professionals who'd encountered him during custody or abuse investigations, and 2 private investigators who'd refused to continue working for him after being asked to conduct illegal surveillance operations. But we still faced the fundamental problem of time. Pemberton's 48-hour deadline was approaching, and even with all this evidence, we needed a way to present it that would force authorities to investigate Thornfield rather than simply processing the return of his kidnapped children. The solution came from an unexpected partnership. Sheriff Bobby Ramirez had been following our situation with growing concern, not just about the legal implications, but about the potential for violence in his county. When Maxwell contacted him about our evidence against Thornfield, Bobby revealed that he'd been conducting his own quiet investigation. 2 months ago, Bobby explained during a meeting at his office, I received a call from a detective in Nebraska asking about a family matching the Hendersons' description. Seems like this Thornfield fellow has been tracking them through multiple states, always staying just within legal boundaries, but using methods that made local law enforcement uncomfortable. Bobby opened a file that contained correspondence from police departments in Colorado, Nebraska, Utah, and Nevada. All had received similar inquiries from Thornfield's private investigators. All had been asked to conduct surveillance that skirted the edges of legal authority, and all had concerns about the intensive effort being made to locate what was supposedly a straightforward missing persons case. When you coordinate testimony from multiple jurisdictions, Bobby continued, patterns emerge that individual departments might miss. This Thornfield character has been using law enforcement resources across 6 states to conduct what amounts to stalking behavior. Maxwell leaned forward. Sheriff, would you be willing to coordinate with other agencies to present a comprehensive case to federal authorities? Already started, Bobby replied. I've got a conference call scheduled for this afternoon with detectives from 4 states and an FBI agent who specializes in interstate stalking cases. If we can present evidence that Thornfield has been abusing the legal system to pursue victims rather than seeking legitimate reunion with missing family members, it changes the entire dynamic of this case. While law enforcement was building their case, I had to deal with a more immediate problem. Word had spread through Millfield County about the Sullivan family's situation, and the community response was creating its own complications. Neighbors had begun organizing informal patrols around the ranch property. Local business owners were discussing ways to provide financial support if legal fees became overwhelming. The high school had quietly arranged counseling services for Rebecca and Matthew without requiring the documentation that might compromise their assumed identities. The support was touching, but potentially dangerous. If Marcus Thornfield arrived in Millfield County to reclaim his family, he would find an entire community prepared to resist him. While their intentions were admirable, armed civilians confronting federal agents or private security could escalate the situation into violence that would ultimately harm the very children we were trying to protect. That evening, 36 hours before Pemberton's deadline, I gathered the Sullivan family in my living room to explain what we'd discovered and what options we had for moving forward. James sat with military posture that couldn't conceal his exhaustion from months of hypervigilance. Katie held baby Michael while the older children arranged themselves around the room, their faces reflecting varying degrees of understanding about the adult complexities threatening their stability. The evidence we've gathered against Marcus Thornfield is substantial, I began, but presenting it requires you to come forward publicly as the Sullivan family. Your assumed identities as the Hendersons would be exposed, and James would face immediate arrest on military desertion charges. Rebecca, now 16 and old enough to understand the full implications, spoke first. What happens to us if Papa gets arrested? Maxwell answered this question carefully. Initially, you'd be placed in protective custody while authorities sort out the custody issues. But if our evidence against Thornfield is compelling enough, that protective custody might be the first step toward building a case against him rather than returning you to his control. And if the evidence isn't compelling enough, Matthew asked, then you go back to Arizona, I said quietly. And all of us who tried to help you face federal charges for harboring fugitives and interfering with a custody case. The family fell silent, contemplating choices that offered no guaranteed safety, only different types of risk. Katie finally broke the silence. We've been running for 3 years, she said. Our children have never had the chance to feel truly safe anywhere. If there's a possibility that coming forward could stop Marcus permanently, isn't that worth the risk? James reached over to take her hand. Katie, if this doesn't work, if we lose this fight, he'll have legal custody again, but this time he'll know exactly how far we were willing to go to escape him. The consequences. He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood what he meant. Marcus Thornfield's revenge against a family that had exposed his crimes publicly would likely be far worse than anything they'd endured before their initial escape. There is one other option, Maxwell said slowly. It's unorthodox and carries its own risks, but it might give us the best chance of protecting everyone involved. What kind of option? I asked. We arranged for Thornfield to come here, to Millfield County, under controlled circumstances. Instead of waiting for federal agents to arrive and take the family back to Arizona, we create a situation where Thornfield has to defend his claims in front of local authorities who are already prepared to question his motives. The audacity of Maxwell's suggestion was staggering. Instead of hiding from Marcus Thornfield or surrendering to his legal representatives, we would invite him to Montana and force a confrontation on our terms, in our territory, with our evidence, and witnesses ready to present. How would that work practically? James asked. Pemberton wants a meeting with the family to confirm their identities. We agree to that meeting, but we structure it as a formal proceeding with legal representation, law enforcement present, and court reporters documenting everything that's said. If Thornfield wants his family back, he has to make his case publicly rather than through private negotiations. And if he refuses to participate in such a meeting, Maxwell smiled grimly. Then we present our evidence to federal authorities anyway, but from a position of cooperation rather than resistance. We demonstrate that the family is willing to address custody issues through proper legal channels, while Thornfield appears to be avoiding scrutiny of his claims. Katie looked around the room at her children, then back at the adults who had become their unlikely protectors. When would this meeting happen? Tomorrow afternoon, Maxwell replied. Pemberton's deadline expires tomorrow evening. If we're going to force this confrontation, it has to be immediate. And if Marcus comes here himself, then we find out whether a man who spent 3 years hunting his family through legal technicalities and private investigators is prepared to face public scrutiny of his fitness as a father. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after mountain snowfall. The ranch looked pristine under fresh powder, peaceful and isolated in ways that had originally attracted me to this property. But underneath that tranquil surface, 24 people were preparing for a confrontation that could determine the future of 6 children and the fate of everyone who tried to protect them. Sheriff Bobby Ramirez arrived at 10 a.m. with 2 deputies and a federal agent who'd driven up from Denver overnight. Dr. Mitchell came with documentation of the children's medical histories and evidence of trauma symptoms. Maxwell had arranged for a court reporter and video equipment to document everything that transpired. Most importantly, Carmen Santos had agreed to travel from Phoenix with her evidence against Thornfield, despite the personal risk her testimony represented. At 11:30, a convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled into my ranch driveway. Marcus Thornfield had come to Montana. I watched from my office window as he emerged from the lead vehicle, and I was struck by how ordinary he appeared. Medium height, expensive suit, silver hair carefully styled. The kind of man you'd see at any corporate event or charity fundraiser. Nothing in his appearance suggested the monster that the Sullivan family had described, which made him infinitely more dangerous than if he'd looked the part of an obvious predator. Pemberton emerged from the second vehicle, along with two other men in suits who had the bearing of private security rather than legal representatives. The third SUV contained what appeared to be additional security personnel and someone with professional video equipment. Thornfield had come prepared for a media event, ready to document his emotional reunion with his kidnapped family for whatever narrative he planned to construct afterward. But as he approached my front door, he was walking into a situation unlike anything his money and legal strategies had prepared him for. The confrontation took place in my ranch's main conference room, a space I'd designed for business meetings that now hosted the most important negotiation of my life. Marcus Thornfield sat across from the Sullivan family, separated by a wide oak table but connected by 3 years of pursuit and terror that filled the room like toxic gas. "Catherine," Thornfield said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled emotion that suggested practiced performance, "you can't imagine how worried I've been. How much the children and I have missed you." Katie Sullivan met his gaze directly, her spine straight with resolve I'd never seen from her before. "Marcus, these children are safe and happy here. They're attending school, receiving medical care, living without fear for the first time in years." "Living without their father," Thornfield replied smoothly. "Rebecca, sweetheart, don't you want to come home?" Rebecca, who had been silent since Thornfield entered the room, finally spoke. "This is our home now, and James is our father." The flash of rage that crossed Thornfield's face lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was captured by both the video equipment he'd brought and the recording devices we'd arranged. In that instant, his carefully maintained facade slipped enough to reveal the controlling fury that had driven him to pursue this family across the country for 3 years. "Rebecca," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the room tense, "you're confused about what's best for you. You're still a child, and children don't get to make decisions about where they live or who their parents are." That's when Maxwell began presenting our evidence. Carmen Santos's testimony about workplace harassment and abuse, documentation of the pattern of silenced domestic violence complaints, expert testimony about the psychological trauma evident in all 6 children, records of Thornfield's use of law enforcement resources to conduct what amounted to interstate stalking. With each piece of evidence, Thornfield's composure deteriorated further. The practiced victim act gave way to angry denials, then to threats against witnesses, then to the kind of proprietary rage that revealed his true character. "These children belong to me," he finally said, abandoning all pretense of paternal concern. "I've invested years of my life and hundreds of thousands of dollars in raising them. No one has the right to take my property away from me." Property. He'd called them property, in front of law enforcement officers, court reporters, and video cameras. It was the confession we'd hoped for, but never expected him to make so explicitly. The federal agent, who had been quietly observing throughout the meeting, stepped forward at that point. "Mr. Thornfield, based on the evidence presented here today and information we've received from multiple law enforcement agencies, we're opening a federal investigation into allegations of child abuse, domestic violence, and misuse of interstate commerce laws. The children will remain in protective custody here in Montana while that investigation proceeds." "You can't do this," Thornfield snarled, his mask finally completely gone. "I have legal custody, I have court orders, I have rights." "You have allegations to answer," the federal agent replied calmly. "And until those allegations are resolved, these children's safety takes priority over your custody claims." Marcus Thornfield left Montana that evening without the family he'd spent 3 years hunting. More importantly, he left as the subject of a federal investigation that would ultimately uncover enough evidence to result in criminal charges for child abuse, domestic violence, harassment, and fraud related to his missing persons claims. 6 months later, James Sullivan received an honorable discharge from the military after testifying about the circumstances that led to his desertion. Katie was granted full custody of all 6 children after Thornfield's parental rights were terminated. The family kept the last name Henderson, but only because they'd grown attached to it during their time in Montana. Rebecca graduated from Millfield High School as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Montana State University. Matthew made the varsity baseball team and discovered a talent for ranch work that suggested he might have a future in agriculture. The twins thrived in the stability of permanent residence and consistent schooling. Christopher stopped having nightmares for the first time in 4 years, and baby Michael grew into a toddler who knew nothing of fear or hiding, only the security of a family that was finally truly safe. As for me, I learned that wealth and success mean nothing if they're not used to protect people who can't protect themselves. The Henderson Ranch, I still call it that despite owning it, became the permanent home of a family that had taught me more about courage and sacrifice than any business transaction ever could. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children are playing in the yard and James and Katie are working in their garden, I remember that snowy morning when I raised my hand at a courthouse auction. I thought I was buying property, but what I actually purchased was the chance to be part of something much more valuable than land or cattle or profit margins. I bought the opportunity to be the kind of person who helps when help is needed, who stands up when standing up matters, and who understands that the most important investments we make are in the lives of people who deserve better than the circumstances that brought them to our attention. The territory did indeed talk about what happened on those courthouse steps, but the story they tell now isn't about a millionaire's charitable gesture. It's about a community that protected a family, about children who found safety, and about the difference between legal rights and moral obligations. And in the end, that's a story worth telling. The legal proceedings that followed Marcus Thornfield's departure from Montana stretched across 18 months, creating a complex web of federal and state cases that would reshape how authorities handle interstate domestic violence and child abduction cases. What we had uncovered in our desperate 48-hour investigation became the foundation for a much larger examination of how wealthy abusers use the legal system to maintain control over their victims. The FBI's investigation expanded far. Beyond Thornfield's pursuit of the Sullivan family, federal agents discovered that he had been using his network of car dealerships as a sophisticated money laundering operation, funneling profits through offshore accounts to fund private investigators, corrupt officials, and intimidation campaigns against former employees and romantic partners. The scope of his criminal enterprise was staggering. Over 24 women across 4 states had been systematically silenced through financial pressure, legal threats, or worse. Detective Maria Gonzalez from the Phoenix Police Department, who had been investigating Thornfield for years without sufficient evidence to build a case, called me personally to express her gratitude for the breakthrough our evidence had provided. She'd been watching him destroy lives for over a decade, always staying just within legal boundaries, while wielding his wealth and connections like weapons against anyone who dared to challenge him. "Mr. Blackwood," she said during that call, "you have no idea how many women are sleeping better at night, knowing that Marcus Thornfield will never be able to hurt another family the way he hurt yours." The trial itself became a media sensation that dwarfed the original courthouse auction coverage. National news networks covered the proceedings extensively, fascinated by the story of a millionaire rancher who had risked everything to protect a family of strangers. But the real stars of the coverage were the Sullivan children, whose courage in testifying against their former captor inspired legislative changes in how courts handle custody cases involving allegations of abuse. Rebecca's testimony was particularly powerful. Now 17 and poised with the confidence that comes from genuine safety, she described years of psychological manipulation and sexual abuse with a clarity that left the courtroom in stunned silence. When Thornfield's defense attorney attempted to characterize her statements as teenage rebellion against parental authority, she looked directly at the jury and said simply, "A father protects his children. He doesn't own them." That single statement became a rallying cry for child advocacy groups across the country and was eventually incorporated into training materials for family court judges and social workers. Rebecca's words captured something fundamental about the difference between parental love and parental control that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of our case. Matthew, now 15 and several inches taller than when I first met him, testified about the hypervigilance that had characterized his childhood under Thornfield's control. He described years of monitoring his siblings' behavior, trying to anticipate and prevent situations that might trigger their stepfather's rage. His account of the family's 3-year flight across the country, always looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit, painted a vivid picture of what it means to live as prey. Even the younger children provided testimony, though the court took special care to protect them from direct cross-examination. Christopher, now 8 and thriving in 3rd grade, drew pictures that showed the difference between his memories of life in Arizona and his current reality in Montana. The contrast was stark. Dark, confined spaces with threatening figures in the background versus bright, open landscapes with smiling faces and animals. The twins, David and Daniel, had developed into confident 10-year-olds who played Little League Baseball and participated in 4-H club activities with the easy camaraderie of children who no longer feared that their normal behavior might provoke violent consequences. Their testimony focused on simple but powerful details, being allowed to laugh loudly, run in the house, ask questions without permission, freedoms that most children take for granted, but which had been forbidden during their years under Thornfield's control. James Sullivan's military record became a crucial element in the prosecution's case. Far from the unstable veteran that Thornfield's legal team had tried to portray, James was revealed to be a decorated soldier whose service record included 2 tours in Afghanistan and commendations for his work training local security forces. Character witnesses from his military unit testified that his decision to go AWOL was completely out of character, suggesting extraordinary circumstances that would drive such a dedicated soldier to abandon his career. The military's decision to grant James an honorable discharge rather than pursuing court-martial proceedings sent a powerful message about how the armed forces view soldiers who sacrifice their own futures to protect children from abuse. General Patricia Williams, who oversaw the discharge review, stated publicly that sometimes the greatest act of service a soldier can perform is protecting innocent lives, even when that service requires personal sacrifice. Katie's transformation throughout the legal proceedings was remarkable to witness. The frightened, hypervigilant woman I'd first met on the courthouse steps gradually emerged as a strong, articulate advocate, not just for her own family, but for other women trapped in similar situations. She began speaking at domestic violence conferences, sharing her story to help other victims understand that escape was possible even from seemingly impossible circumstances. Her relationship with James deepened during this period as well. What had begun as a protective alliance forged in desperation evolved into genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to their children's welfare. They were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch 18 months after Thornfield's conviction, surrounded by the community that had rallied to protect them when protection was desperately needed. The wedding was a celebration not just of their personal happiness, but of the family's final emergence from the shadow of their past. Rebecca served as Katie's maid of honor, radiant in a way that would have been impossible during their years of hiding. Matthew walked his mother down the aisle, with the kind of proud bearing that suggested he finally felt safe enough to let his guard down. The younger children served as flower girls and ring bearers, giggling and playing with the unconscious joy of children who had never known real fear. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had first alerted me to signs of trauma in the Henderson children, documented the psychological recovery in a case study that became required reading in pediatric psychology programs across the country. Her research demonstrated how quickly children can heal from even severe trauma when provided with consistent safety, appropriate therapy, and the knowledge that the adults in their lives are committed to protecting them. The Henderson children, she wrote, represent hope for every child trapped in abusive situations. Their recovery shows us that damage done by cruelty and control can be undone by patience, love, and unwavering commitment to their safety and well-being. The financial impact of the legal proceedings was substantial for everyone involved. My legal fees exceeded $200,000, while the cost of providing security and housing for witnesses during the trial added another $100,000 to the total. But every penny was worth it when Thornfield was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. More importantly, the civil lawsuits that followed resulted in substantial financial settlements for the Sullivan family and the other women who had been victimized by Thornfield's systematic abuse. The money couldn't undo the years of trauma they had endured, but it provided resources for therapy, education, and the kind of security that allows healing to begin. The ripple effects of our case extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Montana legislature passed new laws strengthening protections for domestic violence victims who cross state lines to escape their abusers. Congress held hearings on how wealthy individuals manipulate the legal system to maintain control over their victims, leading to federal legislation that makes such abuse a specific crime with enhanced penalties. Most importantly, law enforcement agencies across the country received new training on recognizing the patterns of behavior that indicate systematic abuse rather than legitimate custody disputes. The techniques Thornfield had used, hiring multiple private investigators, filing strategic legal motions to drain his victims' resources, using missing persons reports to weaponize law enforcement, became part of a playbook that authorities learned to recognize and counter. Sheriff Bobby Ramirez became something of a national expert on these issues, testifying before congressional committees and training law enforcement officers in other states on how to distinguish between genuine missing persons cases and situations where the legal system was being manipulated by abusers. His department received federal grants to develop protocols that other rural agencies could adapt for protecting families in similar circumstances. 5 years after that snowy morning at the courthouse, the ranch had become something none of us had anticipated. What started as a simple property acquisition had evolved into an informal sanctuary for families transitioning out of dangerous situations. With the Sullivan family's help, we established a non-profit organization that provided temporary housing, legal assistance, and educational support for women and children fleeing domestic violence. The program operated quietly, without fanfare or publicity that might compromise the safety of the families we were helping. But word spread through networks of advocates and attorneys, and we began receiving requests for assistance from across the region. Each family brought their own story of courage and survival, their own journey from terror to safety to healing. Rebecca Henderson, as she chose to continue calling herself, graduated from Montana State University with degrees in social work and criminal justice. Her senior thesis, titled From Victim to Advocate, Using Personal Experience to Transform Systems, became the foundation for a graduate program in victim advocacy that she developed in partnership with the university's law school. Her work focused on training law enforcement officers, social workers, and attorneys to recognize the sophisticated strategies that wealthy abusers use to maintain control over their victims. She understood from personal experience how someone like Marcus Thornfield could appear to be a loving father while systematically destroying his family's sense of safety and autonomy. Matthew chose a different path, but one equally rooted in his family's experience. After graduating from high school as class president and captain of the baseball team, he enrolled in the agricultural program at Montana State, with plans to return to the ranch as a full partner in our operations. His vision was to expand our land management practices to include therapeutic programs for children who had experienced trauma, using the healing power of working with animals and land to help them rebuild their sense of security and self-worth. The younger Henderson children grew into confident teenagers who spoke openly about their past when they felt it could help others, but never defined themselves solely by their experiences as victims. They became advocates in their own right, participating in school programs about bullying and abuse prevention, speaking to other children about the importance of telling trusted adults when something doesn't feel safe. Christopher, now 12 and an accomplished horseman, often told visitors to the ranch that his favorite thing about Montana was knowing that tomorrow will be just like today, safe. His simple words captured something profound about what we had accomplished together. Not just rescue from immediate danger, but the restoration of trust in the fundamental reliability of adult protection and care. As I write this, sitting in the same office where I first learned the full truth about the Sullivan family's circumstances, I can see Matthew working with a group of horses in the training corral, while Rebecca helps a new family unload their belongings from a battered sedan. Katie is in the garden with two other women whose stories I'm still learning, teaching them how to vegetables for the winter. James is somewhere on the property with the older boys, probably discussing the finer points of fence repair or cattle management. It's an ordinary scene that represents something extraordinary. A family that was nearly destroyed by evil has not only survived, but thrived. And in thriving, they've created space for other families to begin their own journeys toward healing and safety. The story that began with a simple property auction became something much larger, a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing up to bullies regardless of their wealth or status, and the fundamental truth that protecting children from harm is not just a legal obligation, but a moral imperative that transcends personal cost or convenience. Sometimes I think about that 7-year-old boy asking, "Why won't anyone help us?" on the courthouse steps all those years ago. The answer, as it turned out, was that someone would help, but it took a community working together to make that help effective and lasting. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. That protecting innocence and fighting evil is never a job for just one person, but rather a responsibility we all share when we choose to see beyond our own immediate concerns to the welfare of those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, we all found something we hadn't known we were looking for. The Henderson family found safety and belonging. I found purpose beyond profit, and an entire community discovered that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult and expensive and risky, creates bonds that last far longer than any business, transaction, or legal contract. That's the story worth telling, and it's still being written every day on this ranch in Montana, where children learn that they matter more than anyone's twisted concept of ownership, and where families discover that home isn't just a place, it's the knowledge that someone will always fight to keep you safe. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.